It is truly wild to me that we know more about the health of our cars, our finances, and our computers than we do about the health of our own bodies. We literally have to jump through hoops to get a basic once-a-year sense of our metabolic health if our doctor orders the appropriate labs. In 22 US states, patients still don't legally own their own medical records. Instead, doctors and hospitals do. This is very strange. Most of us have had that disappointing experience of going to the doctor to review our lab work only to have them tell us one of two things. First, everything looks fine, you're good to go, even when you definitely don't feel fine. Or they might say, the result is a little off, we're gonna put you on this medication, without actually talking in depth about why or what you can do about it through your daily dietary and lifestyle choices. The unfortunate truth is that most doctors don't really understand how to interpret metabolic lab results in a meaningful way. Sure, doctors can order a potassium infusion if potassium is low, or they can order a statin if LDL cholesterol is high, or they can prescribe an antibiotic if the white blood cell count, a marker of infection, is above 11,000. But push a little deeper into how the labs are interconnected or what the constellation of labs and biomarkers says about the underlying cellular physiology in your body, and you're likely to get a blank stare. Physicians are trained to follow rules with lab interpretation rather to step back and really read the integrated tea leaves and what it all means. And in more than 88% of US adults, the tea leaves of the biomarkers are reading bad energy. My co-founder at Levels, Josh, calls this new era that we're entering into the era of bioobservability, the ability to observe inside our own bodies. There's more readily available blood tests and real-time sensors filtered through AI analysis to give us a highly personalized understanding of our own bodies and a personalized plan to meet our body's needs with our daily choices. This can't really be crystallized into a 15-minute doctor's visits because a lot of this work happens at home in our daily life. None of this is a knock on doctors. Every doctor I know went into medicine to help patients, and they are working day in and day out to do what they can to keep their patients healthy. But the reality is we were not trained through a metabolic lens. And I truly believe that every person has the ability to really get a good grasp on their biomarkers, and we should have basic knowledge about how to interpret our own biomarkers. And this is where thoughtfully chosen technology and tools that we can bring into our daily life can help support us in that journey. So we're going to talk through a lot of this today. Which biomarkers we should be asking for, which lab tests are high yield for understanding our own metabolic health, and which thoughtfully chosen technology can help us better understand our health and empower us. So let's start with biomarkers. There are tons of lab tests and biomarkers out there, but which ones are the most important for understanding good energy? Well, first of all, we can go back to 5 basic biomarkers that we talked about in the beginning of this course that really everyone should understand. And these generally come at no cost during our annual physical. The key is understanding how to interpret them and how to interpret them together to understand our level of good energy. So the first I want to talk about is triglycerides. So triglycerides is answering the question for us, basically, am I overwhelming my cells with glucose? Because when we consume more glucose than our body can handle, what's it going to do? It's going to turn it to triglycerides. So simply put, when we consume more sugar or more carbohydrates than our liver mitochondria can handle, the excess glucose is converted into triglycerides, and then it's shipped out into the bloodstream to be stored in the tissues and the muscles. In terms of what raises our triglyceride levels, the simple message is that high triglycerides are almost certainly a warning sign that you're eating too much sugar, too much refined carbs, and also alcohol can contribute to triglycerides. It also might mean that you're probably not engaging in enough physical activity, which can use and break down those triglycerides. So what do we need to do? We need to really be thoughtful about how much of those refined carbs and sugars we're eating, because they're probably overwhelming the liver and turning it into fat. the storage form of fat, which is triglycerides. So what does this mean? It means cutting out the soda, cutting out the sugar-sweetened beverages, cutting out the juice, cutting out the added sugar and refined grains as best we can. So let's talk about ranges. The triglyceride range that's considered normal by standard criteria, what you'll see on the lab slip if you get it back from the doctor, is less than 150 milligrams per deciliter is normal. What we really want to shoot for optimal health is actually less than 80 milligrams per deciliter. When I talk about optimal ranges for a value like triglycerides, there's still actually quite a bit of nuance and even disagreement about what is considered optimal. But one thing is clear. Optimal ranges are often stricter than the standard ranges that you're going to see on the pamphlet with your result or the printout that you get from your doctor. But we don't want to just be normal. We want to have optimal health in our lifetime. And when you look at the research, people with the lower levels of triglycerides tend to avoid disease better than the people who are just falling into the normal range, especially the high normal part of that range, closer to 150 milligrams per deciliter. I'll mention in my own case, I've had similar triglyceride levels on two very different diets. I used to actually be vegan, and I was on more of a whole foods plant-based diet, which was pretty much higher carbohydrate, lower fat. And now I'm more on an omnivorous diet where I eat some animal products, thoughtfully sourced animal products, higher fat, and sort of moderately low carb. And weirdly enough, on both of these diets that were very different, my triglycerides were 47 milligrams per deciliter. So this is quite low, and this is in the optimal range. But a question might come up like, wait a minute, if you were eating like a higher carb diet and a lower carb diet that had sort of different characteristics, how could your triglycerides be exactly the same? The way I think about it is that both diets, even though they were of a different type and different macronutrient composition, neither of them overwhelm my cells with too much energy to process. And the reason for that is because both diets, the vegan diet and the omnivorous diet, focus on unprocessed whole foods that came from good soil and were nutrient rich. So what did that do? In both diets, it cued the complex satiety mechanisms in my body to basically signal me not to overeat. And so that's a key thing here. The body knows what's to do, I believe, with a variety of different macronutrient ratios. That's why it's not as important to be so dogmatic about the diets that we're engaging in, paleo, vegan, carnivore, omnivorous, whatever it is. It's really about focusing on whole, real foods that are going to cue our satiety mechanisms and help our body take in the amount of energy substrate that it needs to help us function optimally. It's when we start eating the ultra-processed, ultra-refined foods that we actually really subvert our exquisite satiety mechanisms and overeat. And when you're overeating and we have chronic overnutrition, that's when the body's going to be overwhelmed and it's going to have excess glucose. It's going to repackage it as triglycerides. It's going to raise our triglyceride levels. So that's triglycerides. Triglycerides, simply put, is a representation of excess glucose being converted into fat in the body. So next, let's talk about high density lipoprotein cholesterol, or HDL cholesterol. This is what's often referred to as good cholesterol, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. When we talk about cholesterol testing, it's actually kind of a misnomer because we're not actually talking about cholesterol itself as an isolated molecule. Cholesterol and triglycerides actually can't travel around the body by themselves because they're both fatty substances and they can't dissolve in the blood, which is mostly water. You know what happens when you put oil in water, they separate. So instead, cholesterol and triglycerides are packaged inside a sphere made of molecules that can dissolve in water. And this sphere is covered in protein markers, kind of like shipping labels that allow cells to recognize it and interact with it. So the sphere can drop off its fat and drop off its cholesterol cargo. And the specific protein on the surface of that lipoprotein, along with the ratio of cholesterol and fat inside that little sphere traveling through the blood, determines whether it's called a high-density lipoprotein cholesterol particle or a low-density lipoprotein cholesterol particle. And there's other types as well, like VLDL. So HDL is often referred to as good cholesterol because it helps remove cholesterol from the blood vessels and carry it back to the liver for processing and elimination from the body. And this process of reverse cholesterol transport can help prevent the buildup of plaque in the arteries and reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke. So this is why high levels of HDL in the bloodstream are considered to be beneficial for cardiovascular health. This, similar to heart rate variability that we talked about before, HDL is one of those biomarkers where you actually want it higher. More research is coming out pretty much daily about the nuances of HDL, and there's some more attention being paid to actually specific subtypes within this larger family of cholesterol molecules. But generally, we think about HDL as being associated with better metabolic health. And again, HDL is one of the only lab tests you want to be high rather than low. The range of HDL that's considered normal by standard criteria is greater than 40 milligrams per deciliter in men and greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter in women. In terms of optimal range, which we're going to talk about for every biomarker, what's the optimal range compared to the normal range, we actually find that there's a U-shaped relationship between HDL levels and the development of diseases. So both very low and very high are actually associated with increased risk. So the sweet spot for lowest risk appears to be between about 50 to 90 milligrams per deciliter, although sources vary. So even though normal ranges say, anything above 50 milligrams per deciliter is fine for women, we actually probably want it to be higher, up closer to the 90s, so 60, 70, 80, 90. So that's the optimal range that we're shooting for. So how can we try and maximize our good cholesterol and minimize our bad cholesterol? It all ties back to the good energy habits. When we focus on foods that are low in added sugars, low in saturated fats and trans fats, these are the fats that are mostly found in processed food, and instead focus on the principles of good energy eating and living, getting our fiber, getting our micronutrients, getting our omega-3s, getting our probiotic sources, getting our healthy protein. This is going to help us boost our good cholesterol. The next biomarker I want to talk about is fasting glucose. A high fasting glucose indicates insulin resistance, and this is again the process where glucose is blocked from getting into our cells because of underlying bad energy processes in the cells. When there's metabolic dysfunction in the body and the cells can't efficiently turn glucose into ATP in the mitochondria, again because of bad energy processes, the body literally will block more glucose from coming into the cell, and the cell does this through insulin resistance. It blocks the hormone insulin from acting, and insulin is what helps glucose get into the cell. So if it's blocked, it basically prevents more glucose from coming into the cell and overwhelming it. For fasting glucose, the range that is considered normal is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. But a lot of research shows that we actually want it in a lower range, and ideally we want it to between 70 and 85 milligrams per deciliter. Again, harkening back to one of my favorite metabolic health thought leaders, Dr. Robert Lustig, he mentions that once the fasting glucose gets to over 100 milligrams per deciliter, metabolic syndrome is in full force, and there are fewer options for prevention anymore. Now you're in full-fledged treatment mode. This is wild. Basically, what this says is that what we consider quote-unquote normal in standard practice, which is anything under 100 milligrams per deciliter, that we should think of that 100 milligrams per deciliter as a value that we never want to go over. We don't even really want to get close to it. We want to keep it in the low end of normal, optimal, which is more 70 to 85 milligrams per deciliter. So if you go into your doctor's office and they say, your fasting glucose is 99 milligrams per deciliter, you're fine, you're not at 100 yet, really question that. You really want to actually get lower than that into the really safe range at the low end of normal. Above and beyond fasting glucose, I believe that the best way to test for that early insulin resistance is actually by testing fasting insulin. Unfortunately, this is not a standard lab test in the United States, despite it being pretty cheap and easy to test. You really need to ask your doctor for this if it's going to be ordered on your lab panel. But there's good reason to show that it's important. There was a study from premier medical journal, The Lancet, that showed that insulin resistance can actually be picked up more than a decade before fasting glucose hits the diabetic range. And we can find that by testing fasting insulin. It will basically change a lot earlier than fasting glucose will. And the reason for this is interesting, and I'll share a little bit more about this. So essentially, when bad energy processes are developing in the cell and the cell starts to develop insulin resistance, basically what that's saying is the cell's like, we're going to block the insulin activity so that we don't get more glucose into the cell because the body can't process it. Well, the body is like, we want to get this glucose into the cell, so it actually pumps out way more insulin to try and force the glucose into the cell. So that's called hyperinsulinemia, high insulin levels. And high insulin levels are essentially a response to bad energy, a response to insulin resistance at the level of the cell. So the body's churning out more insulin to essentially push the glucose into the cell. And that process can happen for years and make the glucose actually seem normal in the bloodstream, because as the body's essentially pushing that glucose into the cell, the glucose levels look fairly normal, but the insulin levels are rising and rising and rising. So if you check the fasting insulin levels, you might see that it is starting to rise out of the normal range far earlier than the blood glucose levels start to rise. So that's why it's a really important early test for insulin resistance while the body's kind of trying to compensate in the early stages of insulin resistance. The next biomarker we're going to talk about is not in the blood, it's actually blood pressure. Blood pressure is so important and it's so easy to measure. High blood pressure is the most common preventable risk factor for cardiovascular diseases, things like heart disease, heart failure, stroke, heart attacks, and more. And high blood pressure is the largest contributor to death and disability in the entire world. High blood pressure exerts its damaging effects on the body by hurting the delicate lining of blood vessels and contributing to stiffness and blockages in the vascular system that can cut off critical blood flow in subtle ways over long periods of time. Blood pressure is directly related to insulin resistance. Interestingly, one of the many functions of insulin is to stimulate a molecule called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a chemical that floats around in the bloodstream and dilates blood vessels. And it's released from cells of the blood vessel wall to essentially promote the dilation of the blood vessels. But in insulin-resistant bodies, this process of nitric oxide synthesis is impaired. So that leads to less dilation of the blood vessels and, of course, higher blood pressure. And bad energy processes make this worse. Increased inflammation from bad energy also leads to high blood pressure by similarly downregulating nitric oxide synthase, which is the enzyme that produces nitric oxide. And then, to add insult to injury, oxidative stress also induces high blood pressure by causing damage to blood vessel walls. So there's really just this whole swirl of problems happening that all compound each other, that's at the nexus of oxidative stress damaging the blood vessel walls and chronic inflammation downregulating nitric oxide synthase and high blood pressure because insulin resistance is reducing nitric oxide activity. So the real moral of the story is, as blood pressure is going up, it could be a sign that bad energy processes are affecting the way our blood vessels are working and blood vessel dynamics. So let's talk about the ranges for blood pressure that we want to shoot for. This is one where the normal range and the optimal range are actually the same. The normal range by standard criteria is less than 120 systolic and less than 80 diastolic. So less than 120 for the top number and less than 80 for the bottom number. And optimal range seems to be pretty much the same as well. Shooting for less than 120 over 80 is a great goal to shoot for. So how do you improve your blood pressure? Again, it all comes back to the good energy habits. Eating well, exercising and moving regularly, limiting alcohol, and focusing on sleep and stress management. I can't emphasize those enough. Sleep and stress both can really spike blood pressure. The fifth biomarker we're going to talk about is waist circumference. And again, this is not something that we get tested in the lab. This is actually just tested by wrapping a tape measure around your waist and seeing what the number says. And the reason waist circumference matters is because it's a marker of the fat around your abdominal organs. The fat around your abdominal organs is called visceral fat. And it's actually biologically a very different type of fat than like the fat that you'd see on your extremities, like in your arms and in your thighs, which is called subcutaneous fat, fat that's just under the skin. We've talked about a lot of different types of fat so far in this course. We talked about brown fat, which is metabolically active, has a ton of mitochondria. Subcutaneous fat is the fat you're going to see under the skin, which is kind of traditionally the type of fat that we think about. And visceral fat is a different type of fat that's very metabolically damaging, and it actually lines the organs in our abdomen, and it tends to be associated with insulin resistance. So if we are more insulin resistant, if bad energy processes are going on in the body actually lays down a layer of fat over the organs and in the organs of our abdomen. And one of the reasons that this type of fat is so problematic is because it actually promotes chronic inflammation. Immune cells will take up residence in that visceral fat and release their inflammatory chemicals and create that bad energy havoc and that vicious cycle of chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction. Also, fat in and around our abdominal organs, like our liver, causes dysfunction in those organs. Like an organ that is got fat in it, in the cells, around the cells, aren't going to function properly. So visceral fat is problematic, and we really want to avoid it and minimize it. And we can get a sense of how much there is by our waist circumference. So in terms of normal ranges, standard criteria say that we want less than 102 centimeters in men and less than 88 centimeters for women. The optimal range actually seems to be much stricter than this. The International Diabetes Federation has proposed much tighter cut points of actually less than 80 centimeters for women and less than 90 centimeters for men. So we focused on those 5 biomarkers for getting a sense of our own metabolic health. And these biomarkers, again, they are cheap. Some of them are free, like waist circumference. They're tests that your doctor may already be ordering for you on your standard physical. And I think it's really important for you to start understanding these biomarkers, start learning how to interpret them for yourself so you can take ownership over understanding your own metabolic health, where you stand, and how to improve. And these 5 biomarkers are great. The ones we just talked about, fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL, waist circumference, and blood pressure, because they're very easy to access and they tell you a lot of information. With that said, there are so many other biomarkers that can tell us about our metabolic health and give us even more richness to our understanding of what's going on inside our bodies, inside our cells. So I'm going to mention a few of them here. We won't go into deep detail into them right now, but on the Commune website associated with this course, you can download a PDF that gives you more information about these lab tests. You can also read lots more about them in my upcoming book, Good Energy. So the other tests that you can ask your doctor for to give you a bigger picture of your metabolic health are fasting insulin, high sensitivity CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, hemoglobin A1C, which is a great test that gives us essentially a 3-month average of our blood sugar levels, uric acid, which is an important one that we mentioned when we talked about fructose in an earlier lecture. Uric acid is a byproduct of fructose metabolism, and when it's high, it's showing us that there could be metabolic problems brewing. We also want to check liver enzymes, since so much of our metabolic processing happens in the liver. If the liver enzymes are high, it can be a sign that this incredible metabolic organ is struggling. And then vitamin D. Vitamin D is associated with dozens and dozens of chemical reactions in the body, many of which have to do with metabolic health. So it's really important to have vitamin D in the optimal range. If you are looking to work with a doctor who is going to order more thorough lab work, order some of these additional tests, the best place to probably look is with a functional medicine doctor. I really like the functional medicine database, ifm.org. It's the Institute for Functional Medicine's provider directory. And these are doctors who have gone through traditional training, but are also interested in really looking through that metabolic root cause framework and are likely going to be more familiar with some of these more advanced tests like those that I just mentioned at the end of this talk. So if you're looking to really work with a doctor on getting a more thorough biomarker assessment, ifm.org provider directory and a functional medicine doctor is a good place to start. Many of these doctors now actually offer telehealth services, and you can access it from pretty much anywhere in the country. There's also a wonderful service that I'll mention called Function Health, which is now letting people access over 100 blood-based biomarkers from all of our body systems with a simple lab draw for a fairly reasonable price. I believe they're doing over 100 biomarkers for less than $500. So this is pricey, but compared to what you'd pay in your traditional doctor's office, it's actually quite affordable. So it's good to see that there are services coming out that are direct to consumer. They're things that you can access on your own to get a better sense of your metabolic health. I believe that knowledge is power, and hopefully this is the year that we really start to understand what our biomarkers mean, where we stand, and how we can improve.